I'm Andrew, and as you can see from behind me, today I'm going to be talking about the topic of my book, Ageless, The New Science of Getting Old Without Getting Old. And I'm really excited that actually I'm also going to be talking about възраст, which is the Bulgarian translation of Ageless. I won't try and pronounce the rest of the title to save my embarrassment and yours, which came out, I think, literally last week by fantastic coincidence, at almost exactly the same time as the Science Festival. So thank you to the few of you. I can see some copies already around in the audience, which is amazing. Why am I so excited about this? Not only, obviously coming out in Bulgaria, but this topic as a whole. Why did I go down this rabbit hole and write a book about it? Well, actually, I started off as a physicist, and I changed my career into aging biology for a variety of different reasons. The key one being a particular graph, and I'm going to be talking a bit about that graph in a second. But I think that this work, this field, aging biology, or biogerontology, as it's sometimes called, is the single most exciting scientific field of our time. And why do I think that? Well, I want to change the way that you think about aging. I think when a lot of us think about it, we imagine a sort of natural, inevitable process, something that happens to all of us as the years go by. It's wrinkles, it's grey hair, it's wisdom, it's getting grandchildren, playing with them. But actually, I think that aging is our greatest humanitarian challenge. Now, that might sound slightly strange if it's the first time you've heard that idea, and that's what I talk about in the book, but I'm going to try and convince you of that during the course of this talk. And we also think it's inevitable, as I said. But actually, what we understand from new science is that it's possible to slow down and maybe even reverse the aging process. We've got literally dozens of ways to do this with animals and with cells in the lab. And we've got dozens of companies that are trying to turn these ideas from something that just works in the laboratory at the moment to something that could work in humans very soon. And so that means we're at this incredibly exciting sort of confluence in the history of medicine. On the one hand, we've got our greatest humanitarian challenge, the cause of all the biggest killers in the modern world, cancer, heart disease, stroke, and so on. And on the other, we've got the biomedical revolution that's waiting to help us rise to that challenge. And that's why I think this is such an exciting topic. I think we're standing on the cusp of a revolution in medicine on the same scale as the discovery of antibiotics. So that's very exciting. But as I said, I was going to explain why I changed from physics to what was eventually a career as a biologist and then an author. And it happened because of a graph. And this is what that graph looks like. It's actually quite a simple graph. It's just how old you are along the bottom, and then your chance of death in that year up the side. Now, I think all of us know that older people are more likely to die, but just how much really shocked me. So that's what the graph looks like. And I think it's worth just sort of going through that to explain what that huge wall of red on the right-hand end actually means in real terms. So let's imagine that you're born, and you're lucky enough to be born in one of the richer countries of the world. That means you start over here on the left-hand end of the graph, and you've got about a 0.5% chance of not making your first birthday, because you could be born with cancer or some kind of genetic problem, or you could get an infectious disease very, very early in life. But if you are fortunate enough to make it through that first year, and most babies in the rich world thankfully are, then your risk of death carries on going down until you reach the age of 10. And current 10-year-olds have a rather special title. They are the safest human beings in the history of our species. They've got a less than 1 in 10,000 chance of not making it to their 11th birthday. But unfortunately, as you can see from the graph, it's all downhill, or rather uphill from there. So when I give this talk to students, I can tell them that their chance of death at 18 is about 1 in 3,000. I'm 37, actually. This graph is slightly out of date, and that means my odds of death are about 1 in 1,000 per year. And let's just think about that for a moment. I quite like those odds, because if they were to continue for the rest of my life, I'd live into my 1,030s on average. Now, unfortunately, of course, as you can see, that doesn't continue. And actually, humans have a risk of death that doubles every 8 years. And what that means is you can start out with something very small, but if you carry on doubling and doubling and doubling it, it eventually gets very big very quickly. So by the time you're 65, you've got about a 1% chance of dying that year. And if you're 80, you've got a 5% chance of not making your next birthday. And actually, terrifyingly, way off the top of this graph, somewhere at the top of this room here, are your odds of death if you're in your 90s. Somewhere in the region of 1 in 6. So that's life and death at the roll of a dice. And you can look at this graph in a couple of different ways. You could firstly look at it as a human and think, my God, this is terrifying. I've got this exponential wall of mortality sort of clicking closer and closer with every year. Or you can look at it as a scientist, and you can say, this is incredible. We've got this awful but incredible synchronicity between the ways that humans die, this synchronized increase in the risk of death. And this 8-year mortality rate doubling time, it's called, the time it takes for the risk of death of a human to double, it's one of the most constant things about human biology. If I plucked someone out of the 1600s, or if I went to the Amazon rainforest and discovered some undiscovered tribe, I wouldn't be able to tell you much about those people necessarily. I'm not an anthropologist. But one thing I could tell you with near certainty is that their risk of death too would double once every 8 years. So it seems to be a fact about our biology. So, what's going on? Why do we have a graph that looks like this as we get older? Well, we're going to have to ask a big question. And that question is, what is aging? And I think when you ask this to most people, as I said earlier, they'll probably think of the cosmetic external signs, things like wrinkles and grey hair. But there's also a load of other stuff going on in our biology. If you ask a doctor, they'll probably think of some of the huge killers in the modern world, things like cancer, heart disease, stroke, and dementia. As I'll try and convince you in a minute, these diseases are basically caused by the aging process. Then there's stuff that I sort of broadly categorize as different kinds of loss. Loss of muscle strength, loss of hearing, loss of sight, all of which conspire overall to result in a loss of independence. It means it's harder as you get older to get on with your everyday life, to enjoy your hobbies, to play with those grandkids, for example. And then there's the stuff that isn't strictly aging related, like, I've had infections even though I'm a young person, you can still get injuries, but they're much, much more severe and significant if you have them when you get older. So if a young person breaks a bone, for example, they'll just be, in a plaster cast for a few weeks or a couple of months, and then they'll basically get better. Whereas if an older person falls and breaks their hip, they can end up in hospital for a few weeks, and they can lose a huge amount of muscle mass, and it can effectively be the beginning of the end. It's got a terrifying mortality rate, not necessarily immediately, but 6 or 12 months down the line, that can be the thing that causes an older person to die. So if we return back to my favorite graph, then we can, instead of plotting the actual chance of death per year, we can plot your chance of getting various diseases. And it just looks shockingly similar. There's cancer, there's heart disease, there's stroke. Dementia is even more striking. It's almost unheard of unless you have particular genetic mutations before the age of 60. But after the age of 60, it doubles every 4.5 years, so it's rising faster even than the risk of death itself. Then let's take another example, this disgusting mucousy green line. That's chest infections. And I don't just mean like a little cold or a sniffle here. This is something that gets right down into your lungs. What you can see is that even in your 20s or 30s, you've got a 1 or 2% chance of getting one of these things every year. But at the beginning of life, when your immune system's underdeveloped, or at the end of life, as your immune system starts to weaken, it gets much, much more likely. And also, crucially, and particularly at the end of life, it becomes much more likely that that thing is going to kill you. So this fundamentally is what's going on underneath the bonnet of the aging process. There's one particular infection that I thought I should probably mention, although we're hopefully seeing, we're toward the end of this particular pandemic. But this is your chance of death if infected with COVID. This is the graph, thankfully, pre-vaccine. But what you can see, again, it's this incredible exponential risk. It rises dramatically. Someone who caught the first strain of COVID in their 30s would have literally hundreds of times less chance of dying than someone who caught it in their 80s, even if those two people were both perfectly fit and healthy otherwise. So being old is one of the biggest risk factors for almost everything. And the good news is that we do have something that we can already do against coronavirus. If you get vaccinated, you can push your risk of coronavirus about 20 or 30 years of COVID age into the future. So an 80-year-old who gets a COVID jab is at about the same risk as an unvaccinated 50-year-old. So it's a hugely, hugely significant thing you can do. But what this graph really shows us is that you can't die without being ill. There's this sort of myth that you can die of old age, peacefully disappearing in your sleep one night, go to bed one night and not wake up the next morning. But actually, most of these ways that you can die, they are long disease processes. You get cancer, you have grueling chemotherapy, you last years and years longer struggling with various other forms of disease as well, until they eventually conspire together to take your life. And the average 80-year-old actually has 5 different medical diagnoses and is taking an average of about the same number of medications to try and combat those diagnoses. So this idea that's sometimes talked about called healthy aging, I really think that idea is just a complete myth. So you might be looking at this and think, are we in the rich world lucky enough, sort of perversely, to suffer from these diseases? Is it because we live long enough that we can experience the diseases of old age? Well, actually, the best way to think about this is to think about global life expectancy. And what I'd like to do now is a quiz. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put some numbers up here on the slide. And this is an example. This is 40 years. I'd like everyone to stand up. And what I'm going to do is once you've all stood up, I'm going to put these numbers up here. And if you think that global life expectancy is this number or lower, I want you to sit down. And this isn't just the life expectancy in the rich countries. This is the life expectancy in all the countries around the world. So I'll give you a free starter for 10. If you thought it was less than 40 years, you'd sit down now. It's not less than 40 years. Stay standing up. Okay, so let's carry on with the experiment. Anyone for 50 years, global life expectancy, 50 years or less. Got one person over there, a bit of a pessimist sitting down. 60 years. Anyone going to take that? Life expectancy in all the countries in the world. Got a few people sat down now. Anyone for 65 years? Yeah, we're definitely dropping like flies now. Anyone for 70 years? I like the optimists, still stood up. Anyone for 75 years? There are some real, die-hard is probably the wrong word, but there are some serious optimists in here. 80 years? Oh, this person is very optimistic about the state of the world. 85, it's not 85, by the way, you can sit down now. Okay, so the actual answer, drum roll please, is 72.6 years. So almost all of you were wrong. And don't feel bad, this is a question that almost everybody does get wrong. In fact, if you give people a multiple choice question in a survey, 3 out of 4 of them will get it wrong. And if you give that same multiple choice question to university graduates, 4 out of 5 of them will get it wrong. So it's as though education makes you stupider. And the point is that we're all taught that there's this huge developing world that's much poorer, has much worse sanitation and healthcare, and therefore much lower life expectancy. But actually, the hugely good news is that this is no longer the case. And in fact, most people in most countries are living longer than they ever have before in history, and to an age that I think a lot of us would call, starting to be old. Now, it's something that I do as a bit of an aside here. Whenever I come to a new country to give a talk, I always like to look up the life expectancy in that country to act as a bit of a reference. And this is the global life expectancy in 2019, because you'll obviously remember there's something that's happened between 2019 and today that might have had a small effect on how long people live. And so therefore, I think this is a more reliable number than the ones that have happened in a couple of more recent years. But I do think it's kind of instructive to look at what happened to Bulgaria's life expectancy. So this is all the way from 1960 up to 2020, actually 2019 on this graph. And you can see this is life expectancy at the side. And for a long time, it was sort of bobbling around, somewhere around 71, 72 years old. There was all this political chaos in the 90s that unfortunately dragged it down by almost, about a year or so. But then, since the 90s, Bulgaria has been on this fantastic, optimistic, upward trajectory. So in 2019, that was the longest life expectancy ever recorded in Bulgaria at 75.1 years. Fantastic, only a few years behind the countries that are leading the world. But then, this is what happened in 2020 and 2021. And this just absolutely staggered me. This is one of the worst performances, I'm sorry to say, in the whole world when it comes to dealing with COVID. Just huge numbers of people dying prematurely, and therefore life expectancy has dropped by about 5 years, which is really remarkable. Now, this really shocked me, so I just wanted to show you all so you were aware of it, because I had no idea it had been quite this bad. But I would like to tell you some optimism as well, having just delivered that news. The good news is, firstly, this is probably a transient phenomenon, because obviously, the coronavirus pandemic is subsiding now. Most people have either been vaccinated or had it, and therefore have at least a degree of immunity. So this is very likely to bounce back when the statistics of 2022 come in, so that's good. But the other thing is to think back to this graph. I showed you the primary risk factor for dying from COVID is being old. It's being aged. And one of the big reasons for that is because our immune system ages. It gets weaker as we get older and less good at fighting off infection. So imagine if we could develop some of these treatments for aging, if we could start rolling them out into the population. Imagine if everyone's immune systems were 5 years younger when the next pandemic comes along, we could push that curve a bit that way. And that would mean that whether it's a coronavirus, whether it's flu, whether it's another disease entirely that we haven't discovered yet, it's very likely that if the population is biologically younger and therefore healthier, they'll be better able to fend off this next potential disease. So that's why I'm super optimistic about using aging biology, not just to treat the sort of things that we imagine as the aging process itself, but wider problems, stuff like infections. So that's sort of the optimistic side of this huge drop. But just to go back, this is where we were. We were talking about global life expectancy. Bulgaria used to be above this, and it's probably about the same as the rest of the world now, because that's probably dropped a little bit as well, thanks to COVID. But what this means is that most people in most countries are living long enough, and here is my favorite graph again, to get a significant way up this exponential rise in risk of death. So rather than aging being a problem of the rich world, aging is a problem of the whole world. And if you run through the statistics, every single day on planet Earth, about 150,000 people die. And if you run the numbers, over 2/3 of those people, so more than 100,000 of them, die because of aging. And that number is obviously increasing as the global population ages. So, what can we do? Well, this has been a pretty depressing first sort of 10 minutes of the talk so far, but there's an optimistic thing that we can do here. And this is the last time I'll show you this graph, I promise. It is my favorite graph. You can see that humans' risk of death doubles every 8 years, I already mentioned. But what about if we look around the animal kingdom? What inspiration can we draw from other creatures, other things that are obviously constrained by the same laws of biology that we are? Let's have a look at this little thing. It's called a hydra. It's about a centimetre-long pond creature. And if you look at its risk of death, it has a rather different profile. It looks something like this. It's got a risk of death of about 0.2% per year. And that means that we think if we ever done an experiment this long, then the hydra, about 10% of them would still be alive after 1,000 years. That's absolutely remarkable. But what's really cool about this isn't that they've got a particularly low risk of death. My risk of death is lower than a hydra at the moment. But the thing that's cool about it is that it's completely flat. It doesn't seem to change with time. And this is a phenomenon called negligible senescence. Negligible, not very much. Senescence is just the biological term for getting old. And that means effectively they don't age by this statistical definition. They stay in an effectively youthful state for the entirety of their lives. And so why can't humans be a bit more hydra? Well, you might be thinking, I can see why humans can't be a bit more hydra, Andrew. We're made up of all these trillions of cells. This is a tiny little pond creature. Like, we're completely different animals. Well, you'll be pleased to hear that the reason that there's a tortoise on the cover, or many of the covers of the book, depending on where you are in the world, is because some species of tortoise, too, are negligibly senescent. This is a Galapagos tortoise. The oldest ever recorded was thought to have lived 177 years. It was brought back from the Galapagos Islands by Charles Darwin and survived him by more than a century. And these two, not only does their risk of death stay constant with time, but also now they're a bit bigger than a hydra. We can start to see they're not getting frail as they get older. They don't get any increased risk of diseases. A lot of these tortoises even stay reproductively active right until very, very late in life, which is another symbol that biologists use to understand aging. So you can see that these things really are getting older without getting old. And this beautiful creature, you might be thinking, Andrew, that's a penis with teeth. It's actually an animal called a naked mole rat. And naked mole rats are strange little animals, as you can see, but they're about the size of a rat or a mouse. Rats and mice live 2, 3, maybe 4 years at the outside. This little wrinkly critter, this is actually a young one, by the way, in spite of how wrinkly he looks, but they can live 31 years, and they seem to be almost immune to diseases like cancer and neurodegeneration, things like Alzheimer's and dementia. So what is it that's going on inside the biology of this little animal that means it can vastly outlive other very biologically similar creatures like rats and mice? And can we learn something from a mammal like this, which is much evolutionarily closer to us than a hydra, and somehow turn back the clock of aging? So we're going to have to go back to this question, and this is the answer that I gave last time. But I think if you look at this slide, you can see that I've really cheated here. So if you think about something like cancer, which is that thing in the top right, there are hundreds of kinds of cancer. It can affect so many different parts of your body. When it comes to hearing loss, there are dozens of different ways that you can lose your hearing as you get older. All of these things should be split out into hundreds of categories. And frankly, it would need a really tiny font and the entirety of this wall to fully express quite how many ways there are for your body to go wrong as you get older. But here's the really exciting thing. If you asked an aging biologist what is aging, the answer they might give you these days is something more like this. Now, I don't need you to read every single one of these, and some of them do have long biology words in them, so you don't have to understand all of this either. But what's really cool about this slide, these are called the hallmarks of the aging process. And these are the biological changes, everything from the molecules inside our cells, things like the DNA damage, which is the first one here, all the way down to the malfunction of whole systems in the body, like the immune system malfunctioning as we get older. And it's the combination of these 10 changes that give rise to all of those diseases, all of the frailty, all of the hearing loss, all of the erectile dysfunction, all of these different things that happen as we get older are some combination of these 10 things. Now, you might be thinking this list doesn't look much shorter, and there are indeed subcategories in a lot of these categories, but it is a lot more compact than thousands of different age-related diseases. And what's most exciting is that we've got ideas to treat every single one of these different hallmarks of the aging process. And the idea is that by tackling the hallmarks, we could get in before the age-related diseases take root and prevent us from getting unwell in the first place. So what on earth does that look like? That all sounds very abstract. I'm talking about hallmarks and what on earth is a mitochondrion and this kind of thing. Well, let's try and drill down by giving you a couple of examples. And one of the ones that I really enjoy talking about is something called senescent cells. Now, senescent, again, we've already come across this word. It's just the biological word for old. These are cells that are essentially old, clapped-out cells that have either divided too many times or accumulated a lot of damage during the course of our lives. So as you can imagine, as you get older, your cells have divided more often, they've accumulated more damage, and so you accumulate these senescent cells in your body as you age. And biologists think that senescent cells are responsible for a whole range of the different consequences of getting older. So let's have a look at an experiment that was done in mice. It was published in 2018. They gave these mice something called a senolytic drug, and this is a drug that can kill those senescent cells, but leave the rest of the cells of the body intact. And if you kill those senescent cells, you essentially make the mice biologically younger. And this is really exciting. It's not just in one way, it's in many, many different ways. So the first thing is that they live a bit longer, which I guess is good news. If you slow down aging, you've got to hope that you're going to extend lifespan a little bit. But most importantly, they don't just live longer, they live better, they live in good health. They get fewer diseases, less cancer, fewer cataracts, less heart disease, and so on. They're less frail than the mice that don't get the drugs. So in these experiments, they basically send the mice to these tiny mouse-sized gyms. And if you get a mouse and stick it on a treadmill and let it run, a mouse that's had these senolytic drugs will run further and faster than a mouse that hasn't had the drugs. So again, that's sort of a proxy for delayed frailty in mice. The mice seem to be less cognitively old. So if you put a young mouse in a maze, for example, in a new environment, it'll try and explore that new environment, find out what's going on, find the food, whatever it is that's going on. But instead, if you put an older mouse into one of these mazes, they're often a bit more anxious, a bit less willing to explore, and removing the senescent cells seems to restore some of that youthful curiosity. And I actually forgot to mention when I started this, these aren't being given to young mice, these are being given to mice that are already very biologically advanced. So these experiments were done in mice that are about 24 months old, and mice obviously live a lot less long than humans, so this is mice that are effectively 70 in human years. And yet you can give them these drugs, and it dramatically reduces a whole different range of aspects of how they age. But I think the most compelling thing is just looking at them. You can see this, these results are so exciting, they've even made it into the August journal, the Daily Mail. This is a picture of a couple of mice. The one on the right has had a senolytic treatment, the one on the left hasn't. They're both the same age. But you don't have to be a mouse expert. I was a computational biologist, tapping away at my computer rather than actually working in the lab. And it's easy to tell, that one on the left, it's got more grey fur, it's got thinner fur, its skin doesn't look as good, looks a bit more saggy. These just look like different ages of mice, and yet what actually differs between them is the fact that they've been given this senescent cell removing treatment. And this, essentially, is the dream of aging biology, is to find treatments that can go in and change these hallmarks before they become problematic, and stop not just one of the diseases of aging, but many, or maybe even all of them. It's quite remarkable. Every time we've looked, these senolytic drugs seem to improve that particular aspect of aging. And so the idea would be that can we turn this from something that works in mice to something that works in humans? And actually, there are 20 or 30 companies that are trying to get senolytic drugs working in people. At first, these drugs are going to be for specific diseases where we know that the senescent cells are a problem. But if those drugs are effective, i.e., they help with the disease, they kill the senescent cells and so on, but most importantly, if they're safe, we could start to think about rolling them out more widely. Because obviously, if you're going to give them to maybe people who are 50, maybe people who are 60, who have just lived long enough that they've accumulated senescent cells in their body, there's nothing, quote-unquote, wrong with them, as would be understood by current medicine. You want to make really sure the drugs are safe before you hand them out. But as we slowly sort of widen the group of patients who are willing to take a punt on these, what are ultimately experimental therapies right now, we could get to a point, maybe even in the next 5 or 10 years, where we're starting to hand these things out as preventative medicine rather than to try and cure a disease that you already have. And I think that's just super exciting. I think this is the sort of the dream of anti-aging medicine, as I said. Now, I normally choose a second hallmark to talk about, and I was trying to work out, which of these to choose from. There's quite a lot of options. But I was told by Lubov, who invited me, that Bulgarians love their yogurt. And so I decided that I'd talk about the 8th hallmark of aging, which is changes to your microbiome. And this is sort of asking the question, why might yogurt be an anti-aging product, and whether or not I'm skeptical of that. So what is the microbiome? Well, it's something I'm sure a lot of you have heard an awful lot more about in the last few years. It's a really hot, sort of up-and-coming area of research. In fact, when I was writing the book, it wasn't amongst the hallmarks of aging. There's been a new paper that came out last year that vindicated me and did indeed include the microbiome, so I was very happy with that. The microbiome is this collection of bacteria that live inside and all over our bodies. And when we think of bacteria, I think a lot of us think about diseases, think about food poisoning, nasty stuff. But actually, there are a lot of helpful bacteria as well. And there are some on our skin, some in our mouths, but by far the majority live in our guts, in our intestines. And in fact, there are so many of these bugs. An average adult human, we think, contains about 40 trillion, so that's 40 with 12 zeros, cells. And there are a similar number of bacterial cells in your intestine as there are human cells in the rest of your body, which is just such a crazy number. Actually, incidentally, that reduces by about 1/3 if you go to the toilet and have a large bowel movement. But then these bacteria can just divide very, very quickly and sort of replenish their populations. It's this incredible dynamic population of microbes in all of our intestines. And these things help us out with all kinds of different things. They help us digest our food. They interact with our immune system in really interesting ways that actually can improve our protection against disease. They can try and fight off the kinds of bacteria that might cause food poisoning. So the microbiome seems to be hugely, hugely important. And I think the one thing that we've discovered so far is it's a very sort of new field of research, but there seems to be strength in the microbiome when there's strength in diversity. And that's to say you want to have thousands of different species of bacteria, of fungi, of viruses, all living inside your intestines, sort of keeping one another in check. And when you get any one of a number of chronic diseases, this can be anything from dementia to diabetes to irritable bowel syndrome, or if you just get older, then the diversity of those microbes can decrease. And what you often find is that it's the more aggressive microbes that tend to take control of the microbiome and possibly drive the process of that disease. So they can worsen the dementia, they could worsen the aging. The real question, of course, is it the microbiome worsening that's driving the aging process or driving the diabetes? Or is it the disease state in the body, the aging process, that's causing the microbiome to enter this sort of dysfunctional state? And I think it's probably a bit of both, because it always is in biology, but at the moment it's a bit of an open question exactly how the causality runs each way. So why might yogurt be anti-aging? Well, we're going to come to that. The first thing I'm going to try and do is convince you that there is a causal relationship between the microbiome and aging. And I'm going to talk to you about some research in this beautiful little creature. This is called a turquoise killifish. It's not a normal animal used in lab research. It's actually a rather strange one. They're normally found in what are called ephemeral pools in Africa. So ephemeral, i.e. they're just very, very brief pools that appear. There's a rainy season, huge amounts of water come out of the sky, and they fill up these sort of indentations in the landscape. And that means that these fish have to hatch from their eggs, they have to grow up and become adults, they have to reproduce, they have to lay more eggs, all in a very, very short period of time before those pools dry up. And then those eggs stay in the sort of dry mud until the rains fall next year, and the whole life cycle repeats. And that means this is a really cool organism to use for aging biology. Because if I want to do an aging experiment in humans, I have to take decades, to give some microbiome-enhancing stuff to the humans, then watch them for years and years and years. And, the worst-case scenario is that your treatment works, and then the people live even longer. So how on earth are you ever going to do this experiment in an animal that's long-lived like a human? Well, the good news is these things, they just live a few months. So you can get the same experiment done, but in a much, much shorter period of time. So what the scientists did with these killifish was they got them to middle age, which is about a couple of months if you're a killifish. And they gave them a really powerful cocktail of antibiotics, which cleared out their whole microbiome. So they've got no bacteria left in their intestines anymore. And then they gave them one of two different options. Some of the fish got a middle-aged microbiome, so they essentially got the same bacteria back that the scientists had just removed. And the other group got given a youthful microbiome, so the combination of bacteria you might find in a young fish. And what they found was that, again, by giving the fish these microbes from the younger fish, it kind of made them biologically younger. So the ones that were in the group where they were given the middle-aged microbes, they ended up living to 4 months. And that's a fairly typical lifespan for one of these killifish. But the ones that were given the young microbes lived an extra month longer again, so they lived to 5 months. And not only that, it's obviously a bit hard to do a post-mortem on a tiny fish and that sort of thing, but the proxy that they used for delayed frailty was the fish that you'd given the young microbiome to, they seemed to dart around in the tank. They were sort of zooming around until much, much later in life. So they seem to stay fitter for longer as well. They're not just dragging out that period of frailty at the end of life. And there have subsequently been similar studies done in mice, where they've shown that you can improve health and extend lifespan by using these microbiome transfers. So I think that's fairly good evidence there might be something there. So the question is, how can we turn this into a medicine? Well, there are a few different options. And to come back to the yogurt, the way that yogurt might be an anti-aging product is because it is a probiotic. And probiotics is a family of different either treatments or foods which contain, we think, beneficial bacteria. So things like yogurt or from other fermented foods like kimchi. And there are some other actual drugs and supplements that are beginning to be experimented with as well. Now, we aren't yet at the stage where I can definitely say, go home and chug a whole pot of yogurt and you'll live forever. Because the problem is we've got a variety of issues with this. So the first thing is we don't fully understand what are the good bugs. It seems likely that the bugs in yogurt and fermented food and stuff are good for you, but we don't exactly know what's the best concentration. We don't exactly know what the best species are. And the second problem is that if you ingest one of these things as food, then the food has to go in your mouth, obviously, down into your stomach, and then your stomach is a really horrible acidic environment if you're a bacterium. So most bacteria just die in the stomach. And we actually don't know how many of the bacteria that, say you eat in a yogurt or you drink in your little probiotic drink actually make it into your intestine where they can do their important and good work. But nonetheless, this is an exciting field of research, and as scientists understand more about which bacteria are beneficial and how best to get them into your guts, then this could be a really cool thing to do. Another idea is something called prebiotics, and this is, again, something that we're experimenting with now, where rather than providing the bacteria directly, you provide food that the good bacteria will enjoy. So this is something that humans aren't very good at digesting. Hopefully the bad bacteria aren't good at digesting either, but the good bacteria can eat, and that allows their populations to flourish. So that's another alternative approach. And there's also an idea called symbiotics, which is where you do both a probiotic and a prebiotic in the same sort of dose. So you're kind of giving the bacteria plus a starter pack of bacteria food. But I think finally, and this might be the most exciting option, is the idea of a microbiome transplant. Now, unfortunately, this is as disgusting as any of you in the audience who have joined the dots will understand it sounds. And this is actually something you might be even more disgusted to hear is already done. So if you've got an infection called C. diff, which is a particularly nasty infectious disease that infects your intestine, one of the treatments is that they can get some freeze-dried poo, let's not put too fine a point on it, make sure there are no bad bacteria in there, and then you can take a tablet containing this freeze-dried poo, and it will go through and repopulate your gut, hopefully, with the beneficial bacteria, which can crowd out the C. diff infection. And this is very effective, and it works in human medicine, so this isn't something that's completely unprecedented. The question is, should we be doing what the killifish does, and ingesting the poo, effectively freeze-dried, of young people as we get older to try and improve our microbiome? Can we come up with some way of breeding those bacteria without me having to use the P word another time, and come up with a way to do this in a way that's a little bit more palatable? But basically, that's the principle, and it does seem as though there's some potential for this research. But as I said, I'm not quite ready to go tell you to all go home and chug a whole pot of Bulgarian yogurt just yet. So back to what is aging. I think this is just such a fascinating field. I could give you a talk twice as long as what I've just said for every single one of these hallmarks, because we've got so many different ideas to treat every single one of them. And I think that's what's the coolest thing. Some scientists might be skeptical that our senolytic treatments will work. Other scientists might think the microbiome's never going to come to anything. But it will be bafflingly unlucky for none of our ideas and any of these hallmarks to make any difference. And in fact, it's quite likely that more than one of them will. And it's also quite likely that if you do take these treatments, they could synergize, i.e., you could add them together and the whole would equal more than the sum of the parts, because they'll improve your aging biology in a variety of different ways simultaneously. So we really are in this position where, as I hope I've convinced you, we've got the world's largest humanitarian challenge. And this science means that we understand enough about that challenge that we can try and do something about it. So I thought I'd finish the talk just with this question, which is actually a bit of a strange question if you think about it. Because if I'd just given a talk on some kind of new cancer treatment, nobody would stick their hand up at the end and say, Andrew, you're going to cure all these kids of leukemia, but won't they get bored with all those extra years on Earth? Or nobody would stick up their hand at the end and say, what about the population? If we cure all these people of cancer, they're going to live longer and use more resources. But nonetheless, if you talk about aging biology, that is the first question that people often ask you. And I can't say I blame them. I think this is, if I could transport myself back 10 years before I'd thoroughly indoctrinated myself with the idea of this being a good thing to do, perhaps I too would have had those exact same questions. So it is important to try and address some of them. But I think the most important thing to remember when you're thinking about any of the sort of moral questions around aging, and there are plenty, is to never forget the fact that 2/3 of deaths globally, and the number that's constantly rising, those are caused essentially by the aging process. And so the other thing is that those deaths are all preceded by disease, by years of suffering. And therefore, there's this huge moral case for causing aging, against which you have to weigh any other potential counter-arguments. It's not to say the counter-arguments aren't important, they aren't significant, but something that's, I would argue, the world's largest cause of human suffering, you're going to need a pretty big counter-argument in order to say, right, that's it, let's call off the research. So let's dig into what is probably the most common objection. And as I said, I think probably something I would have said back in the day, because when I was at the end of my physics PhD trying to decide what I could do to most help the world, I very nearly became a climate scientist. And the way that people often want to know about this is they think about the population. We've got carbon dioxide, we've got other kinds of pollution, we've got microplastics, we've got, the news every day is full of reasons that the planet is doomed. And actually, fundamentally, I actually really hate the word overpopulation, by the way. A lot of people say, aren't we really worried about overpopulation? The problem isn't the people, it's the resources that we use. But nonetheless, having more people does mean we are going to use more resources. So clearly that's some kind of issue. So let's have a little look at the story so far. I didn't explain this graph, did I? So along the bottom here, we've got the year, so since the year 2000 up to the year 2050. And up the side, we've got the world population. So back in 1999, we passed 6 billion. I think it was 2011, we hit 7 billion. We've actually just passed 8 billion, I think, according to the best estimates. So, we're still climbing up this curve here. But the question isn't so much where are we now, but what's going to happen in the future. And so this is what's called the UN's medium variant. This is the United Nations makes a bunch of different guesses about how fast the population is going to carry on rising. And this is their middle guess, basically, their sort of best estimate of what's going to happen. And they think, based on this projection, that by 2050 there'll be 9.7 billion people. So almost another 2 billion based on where we are now. So the question is, what's going to happen if we do something about the aging process? Well, I'm not an expert demographer, so I thought what I'd do instead is download the UN's numbers, and I would cure aging in 2025. Now, let's just take a minute to think about how ridiculous that assumption is. The idea is that not only are we going to sort out all the science, and there is still science to be done, we're also going to roll out these treatments to everybody, no matter where they are in the world, no matter what country they live in the next 2 years. But okay, let's imagine that happens, because as an aging biologist, that's perhaps the most optimistic scenario. If you're someone who's really worried about the population, that's the most pessimistic scenario. That's sort of the extreme case, right? So let's see what happens. Cure aging in 2025, the population in 2050 is 11.3 billion. Now, is that a lot or a little? Well, on the one hand, it is another 1.5 billion mouths to feed, people to clothe, and so on. But on the other hand, it's only a 16% difference. And I would happily work 16% harder to reduce our carbon emissions, to reduce the amount of land that I use by changing my diet. There's a whole load of stuff that we can do to help with the environmental problems that we have now. I'd happily do all of those things a little bit more if it meant essentially no cancer, essentially no dementia, all of these horrible diseases deferred until much, much later in life. And actually, of course, as I said, I was at pains to emphasize, this is a ridiculous scenario where we cure aging in 2 years' time. So in the far more likely scenario that we gradually improve human healthy life expectancy, we're going to have to work less than 16% harder. So I really think that this overpopulation sounds like a really serious threat, but actually it's not as big as you think. The final thing I was going to show you is the UN also does some other projections. So that was the medium variant, so you might be wondering what are the other ones. There's also a high variant and a low variant. The difference between the high variant and the low variant is actually larger than the difference between curing aging and not curing aging. And what's the difference between the high and the low variant? It's just birth rates. We don't know how many kids people are going to have over the next 20 or 30 years, and that's going to make a larger impact on the population, that uncertainty, than even literally curing 90% of deaths. So that's a really remarkable finding, and I think it just shows you that we should be taking this stuff a lot more seriously. I think population modelers aren't thinking about what could happen if we did make serious inroads in the aging process. They're just thinking about birth rates. But actually, having said that, even a complete cure for aging wouldn't have as large an impact as you think. Yes, so I think what I'm going to do now is show you why I wrote the book fundamentally. I said that I was originally tempted into aging biology by this graph that showed you your risk of death with time. But the fundamental reason I think we need to, I wanted to write a book about this rather than carry on researching, is a graph that looks a bit like this. It's the cost of chronic diseases, and this is the cost to the US because it's one of the easiest ones to get figures for. You'll find out why in a second. Cancer costs the US economy $280 billion every single year. It's a remarkable amount of money. And that's not just the treatment, so obviously that's expensive, but it's also the cost to the wider economy. It's people having to give up work because they're ill. It's people having to give up work so they can look after a relative who's got cancer. It's the fact that people aren't spending as much money because they're unwell, and so on and so on. So if you combine all those things together, that is the total cost of cancer to the US economy. We've got heart disease, we've got stroke, we've got dementia. What you can see is that all of these things together, they're all phenomenally expensive diseases, and these are my four sort of examples of diseases that are caused by the aging process. You can see that almost $1 trillion, that's one with 12 zeros, dollars worth of money is effectively lost to aging in the US. And this isn't even all the diseases. Like there are loads of other things. There's the frailty, there's all the other things that aren't called diseases and so on. So you might be thinking, how much money are we putting into research to understand the aging process and potentially do something about this? Well, the reason I chose the US is because they've got an NIA, a National Institute of Aging, and it's got a budget of about $3.5 billion. And that little square is in proportion to the size of the amount of money that's spent. So that's already looking quite pathetic. But unfortunately, I've got some even worse news, which is that there's a sort of running joke in biogerontology that NIA actually stands for National Institute on Alzheimer's Disease rather than aging, because the majority of that funding goes to the neuroscience division, which is trying to understand dementia. This is hugely important work, by the way, don't get me wrong, but it means there's much, much less going into what you might imagine is the basic biology of aging. So other NIA stuff takes up another $1 billion or so of their funding, and that means the actual amount left over to understand the biology of why we grow old is $350 million. That's about $1 per American, which is just wild. Imagine you've got this thing that's got it's an 85% chance of your death in the US being caused by aging, and yet you're contributing $1 a year to researching that thing. It just seems absolutely mind-blowing to me. And so fundamentally, this is why I wanted to write a book about this stuff and get the word out there, because this isn't just a scientific problem, it's also a social and economic problem. It's convincing everyone in the world that this is a hugely important field of research. It's convincing voters, it's convincing the politicians who set science funding. Not only that, it's actually convincing the scientists and the doctors, because often aging biology has been such a small field historically that they haven't been taught about this stuff when they're undergraduates. My wife is a doctor. When she first met me and I first started telling her about this aging stuff, I think she thought I was crazy, because she'd literally never had been told about this. But then, as soon as she actually started, I met her when she was a medical student, when she actually started working as a doctor, it's inescapable that everybody on all of these wards, whether it's broken bones or whether it's cancer, whatever it is, the majority of the people you see are older people with a variety of health problems. And what's particularly crazy about it is, I think she's almost certain to be prescribing these anti-aging drugs that I'm talking about in her career. And yet she hasn't had a single lecture on it as an undergrad, which is mad. So we really need to spread the word and basically, ultimately, make that number, the NIA Aging Biology Division, or the equivalent in whatever country you're thinking about, make that into a bigger slice of the pie and try and reduce some of this economic cost, but also the vast human cost that it represents. So this is the book. Isn't it lovely? I like the Bulgarian tortoise. It's a very nice twist, and I like the 3 rings. There's also a free bonus chapter, I'm afraid only in English, at ageless.link/ethics, because I've had so many questions about what about overpopulation, won't dictators live forever, aren't only rich people going to be able to afford this? Please feel free to ask these in the questions, by the way, but if you want the longest, bestest, in-depth answer I can give you, that's the place to go. I'm also on YouTube. Here is a video about an almost billionaire who claims he's made himself 5 years younger. Sorry, 5 years younger. Whatever on earth that could possibly mean. I'm also on the other social media, and I think we've got time for some questions.
Do you have the other part of your favorite graph? Because it's cut off. It's interesting to see it up to 100%. Doesn't it flatten or go linear again?
That's a very good question. And obviously, it can't carry on rising, because at some point your chance of death is 100%. And so you're just dead. Actually, what we think happens, and this is super hard to work out because statistics, there are so few people who live to these incredibly advanced ages. We think that it keeps on going up and up and up, it keeps on doubling every 8 years, and then by the time you reach maybe 105, your risk of death levels off, but it levels off at about 50-50. So you've got sort of a coin toss every single year as to whether you're going to make your next birthday. And I mean, that's fundamentally why it's so hard to break the world's oldest person record. That was set in 1997 by a woman who made it to 122 and a bit. And I think the current world's oldest woman, and it almost always is a woman, by the way, sorry for you and me, but the world's oldest woman, I think now is 117, 118-year-old, died earlier in the year. If you think about that 117-year-old, she's got to get to 118, 119, 120, 121, 122. That's 2, 4, 6, 8, 16, 32 to 1 against of her actually making it to beat the previous world's oldest woman. So odds of death, as supercentenarians, as they're called, wild. Not good. I hope we've sorted it out before I get there.
What is your bad habits? Do you smoke? Do you drink?
No. I try and keep my bad habits to a minimum. I think probably my worst habit is an addiction to chocolate, which I think in small quantities may have some longevity benefit, but honestly, not great. I think in terms of those kind of bad habits health advice, smoking is terrible. I'm really sorry to tell anyone who smokes in the audience, but it is the single worst thing you can do for your health. Someone who smokes 10 a day knocks an average of 10 years off their life. And you might think it's okay, I don't want to live to 100 anyway, I'm going to live fast, I'm going to die young. You actually also lose 10 years of healthy life, so you effectively just age 10 years faster than everyone else. The good news is, the sooner you quit, the more of those years you can gain back. So that's really, really great news. In terms of alcohol, the situation's a lot more sort of debated. There are some studies that show that a small amount of alcohol consumption can be beneficial. The question is this is the common question you get from scientists, is this correlation or is it causation? And the reason we ask that is, imagine the people who don't drink, and I'm one of them, so I'm allowed to say this, we're a bit weird. There are a variety of reasons we can be weird. You could just be an aging biologist who thinks it's probably a bad idea, or you could be someone who's got a disease and therefore you're not allowed to drink, or you could be someone who's previously had difficulties with alcohol and therefore you decided to abstain entirely. And so this population is strange. And so that if they live slightly less long than the people who are having 1 or 2 glasses a day, what health inferences can we necessarily draw from that? And some studies that have tried very carefully to correct for all these things find that there is no safe amount of alcohol, so you should literally be drinking 0. All of that said, I think, honestly, as long as you're not drinking too much, it's really not that big of a deal. Because if you look at the sort of risk of death, it's typically done in units of alcohol, which is really confusing because like a normal-sized glass of wine is 2 units, a pint of beer. Who drinks half pints of beer? Like a pint of beer is 1 unit. Is 2 units as well. But if you drink like 1 or 2 units a day, you're only like subtracting maybe months from your life. And like if you like beer, that's fine. It's when you start to get to 3 or 4 or 5 units a day that the problem really kicks in. And I think there's a bit of more of a trade-off to be had. So obviously it's a personal thing. Like maybe you're thinking, I don't even want to live another year without beer. In which case, don't like abstain completely. But at the same time, if you are drinking 4, 5, 6 units a day, i.e., 2, 3, 4 drinks, that's the time to start thinking about, this could be having an impact on my life expectancy, I think. So don't have no bad habits. That's boring. Just call myself boring.
Thank you for the great talk. I have.
Oh, sorry. Hello.
Yeah. Hi. I have a couple of questions. The first one, you showed us the spending on anti-aging research in the US. Do you have comparable numbers for the EU and maybe for Japan, the other advanced economies? Because usually the US spends much more on R&D, but Europe and Japan are much more at risk of rapid aging. So I'm just curious how much they spend. Mm-hmm. And the second question is maybe like the flip side of the previous questions. If you're comfortable sharing, what do you do in your life to expand your lifespan? And maybe beyond the obvious, like eating healthy and being active, do you take any supplements? Do you do like fasting or anything like that?
Mm-hmm. Good questions, both. The first one, I'm sorry, both these answers are going to be disappointing. The first answer is we don't know how much we spend in Europe. We don't know how much is spent in Japan. And the reason I chose the US for that example is because it has a National Institute for Aging. I have tried to get these figures. So in a previous life, I did a lot of campaigning about science funding. And because I was based in the UK, I wrote to the UK government. I wrote to charities in the UK. I was like, how much do you spend on aging research? But the problem is they don't really see it as a separate category of research. And so someone who's a cancer researcher, they're like, I'm working on an age-related disease, therefore I'm researching aging. Those two things are not the same. But you can imagine if you're a canny researcher trying to get a research grant and there's a grant available for healthy aging and you work on cancer or heart disease or maybe even some funny little mechanism in a cell that you can say is connected to cancer, you might still get that money. And I think the real problem with this, there are many, many layers of problems here, which is why aging research doesn't get the money it does. But one of the problems is that it isn't recognized as a specific field that should be invested in. And I think it's because, fundamentally, if you're a politician, none of your relatives have died of aging. When Joe Biden launches his cancer moonshot, it's because he really cares about cancer, because he's lost friends or relatives to cancer. He doesn't think about the aging process that caused that cancer in the first place. So I think there's that real disconnect. And I think that's another thing that we have to sort of bridge and get across in order to really start moving the needle on this stuff. My second disappointing answer is that I do try and do all the basic stuff. I try and get my sort of 15 to 30 minutes of exercise a day. I try and eat reasonably well, and by that I mean in a very broad sense of making sure more veg, more beans, more nuts, less meat, probably good. Not drink too much. Definitely don't smoke. But all the sort of let's talk about supplements. I sometimes remember to take some vitamin D. And I actually don't think it's going to work, which seems like a bit of a strange thing. Why am I taking vitamin D when I don't think it's going to work? The reason is, I think there's a small chance it will improve my lifespan, maybe it might improve my immunity a bit as I get older, and it's almost certain not to do me harm, and it's very cheap. Whereas if you're taking a supplement that's got either a higher risk of harm or is more expensive, then it's a much, much bigger gamble. And actually, I think what's something that's quite surprising, a lot of people think vitamin supplements are healthy. It sounds healthy, vitamins are good, right? But when they do these massive, what are called meta-analyses, that's when they pull together all of the trials that have been done on a particular field of research and try and work out what the overall effect is of supplements. They just don't work. Like vitamin C doesn't extend lifespan. All of these things don't make any difference. And there are even some supplements, I think it's vitamin E and beta-carotene, that actually slightly increase your risk of death. We don't really know why. Like the biological mechanisms aren't fully understood, but I think unless you've got a specific vitamin deficiency and your doctor has told you take this supplement, it's not really worth it for most of us.
Hi, thank you very much, first of all, for everything that you said.
Oh, thank you.
I do enjoy it, but I believe that almost everybody here feel positive about those anti-age agents, and it looks like brave future. However, there is one problem that we face nowadays, and almost everybody talking about, even in the news, in the internet, everywhere, it's the overpopulation. What do you think about the overpopulation?
I think that fundamentally, so I already showed you that I think the population isn't going to be as big an impact as we think. And in fact, there's a more optimistic thing that I didn't say during the talk, which is that there's actually a risk that toward the end of the century, we could be looking at underpopulation because birth rates are falling in so many countries. If you look around the European Union, the average birth rate in the EU, I think I had to update the statistics when I last did this talk. It's now 1.4 children per woman. If you imagine that, two parents, you need to have two, and a little bit for people who don't make it to adulthood or don't have kids themselves, have to have about 2.1 children per mother in order to make sure the population stays stable. And the EU is 1.4. There is not a single country in the EU that has a number greater than 2. And this is common throughout a huge amount of the wealthier countries of the world. So it's really unclear how these things are going to play out, and I think people who have confident predictions are basically talking nonsense because you've got no idea what's going to happen in the next 50, 100 years. I think the other thing to bear in mind is that once we've cured aging, I do think that's our biggest humanitarian challenge. I think perhaps our second biggest humanitarian challenge is that there are literally billions of people living in anything from quite a bit poorer to people in the rich world to abject poverty, living on $1.60 a day or something. And we need to lift those people up to enjoy the same lifestyles that we can enjoy in Europe. And that's, I think, one of the most important challenges of our time. And if that's going to happen, well, the top 10% of people by wealth in the world emit 50% of the carbon dioxide, whereas the bottom 10%, sorry, let's get this right. Yeah, the bottom 10%, no, the bottom 50% emit less than 10%. Sorry, let me say that again because I got confused. The top 10% of wealthy people emit 50% of the carbon dioxide. The bottom 50% of poorer people emit 10% of the carbon dioxide. And what that means is if we want to get everyone up to the same living standards as those top 10%, i.e. most of the people in this room, then what we're going to have to do is work out a way to do that with dramatically less impact on the environment. And if we can get our way to net zero carbon dioxide, i.e. everything that we do emits no carbon dioxide on average, then it doesn't actually matter how many people we have, because even if you have a billion more people, if you multiply that by zero carbon emissions, that's still zero. And that's an oversimplification. I'm not trying to throw out the whole of climate change and say this is easy and we got this. There are huge challenges there too. But I really think the emphasis on population is a bit overblown. And the final point I actually make about overpopulation is that imagine, is to reverse the question but in a more forceful way. Imagine we lived in a world where we didn't have aging, where everyone was living, perhaps even hundreds of years, they were living disease-free, et cetera, and we're having a population crisis. It really was overpopulation. There are 20, 30 billion people on the planet. There was just no way. What can we do? Well, the first things we do is we try and reduce our resource consumption. We change the way we live our lives, our social and technological change. We do everything that we could. But if none of that worked, if we absolutely had to come up with a way of getting rid of people, I wouldn't do it with aging. I'd maybe do a Logan's Run thing where you get to a certain age and you're just disappeared by some short instantaneous process. I wouldn't have some decades-long process where you and all your friends and your family decline, get frail, lose their memories, become incontinent, get all these horrible diseases. Why would you do that? And so I think that's one of the most powerful arguments against actually all of these ethical questions, is that if you lived in a world where aging didn't exist, but you had really bad inequality, or you had really bad population problems, or you had a dictator who was living forever, would you invent aging to solve that problem? I can't think of a scenario where I would. Perhaps there's one out there that I haven't thought of. But given that that is the case, I think the same is true in reverse in this world, and we shouldn't be stopping what is essentially medical research in order to try and stop a hypothetical future problem like population.
You said that large quantities of chocolate may be bad for aging, but what about coffee and black tea?
Oh, great questions. And it's really challenging to find out the answer to these things, because the sort of classic way that we find stuff out, it's a bit like the alcohol answer that I gave earlier. People who drink coffee are different to people who don't drink coffee in a variety of ways. I love coffee. But maybe I'm wealthy enough that I've got a coffee machine at home. I have enough time and a relaxing enough job that I can afford to take the time out of my day and go and make myself a coffee. Or perhaps you can go and buy yourself a coffee in a coffee shop. So the people who drink coffee versus the people who don't are actually quite different parts of the population. It's very hard to do the experiments. I think the one sort of hint that we have that things like coffee and chocolate and tea could be good for you is they contain a lot of compounds called polyphenols. And these are sort of complicated molecules that are found inside various things from plants. And there are various reasons we think they might be beneficial. One example of this is that plants create some of these chemicals as what are called defensive chemicals, so they're to try and stop animals from eating them. And they're effectively mild poisons. Obviously, the plants that we eat or drink, those aren't poisonous to humans, otherwise you wouldn't be able to do it. And so they're only very, very slightly poisonous. And that means you can have a process called hormesis. And what hormesis means is that you do your body some harm, but such a small amount of harm that when your body goes back to repair that harm, it actually does slightly too good a job. And I think a really good example of this is exercise. Like when you go for an exercise session, you damage your muscles, you damage your heart. Like exercise, by the way, is the single best thing you can do for your health. But in the short term, you're actually doing your body harm. It's just that when your body goes to repair that damage, it goes a little bit further than it needs to and takes you back to beyond where you were originally. And that's why one of the reasons exercise is beneficial. So for the same reason, we speculate that eating a small amount of poisonous chemicals from plants might be able to improve our health. Now, we don't know exactly whether that is what happens, but if you enjoy coffee, tea, and chocolate, I don't think there's any epidemiological evidence. As long as you're not having 10 cups of coffee a day or as much chocolate as I eat, you're probably fine.
Watching the screenshot from your YouTube channel, I see you have Brian Johnson comments on his protocol. What do you think about his protocol for anti-aging and this 5 years younger?
Well, full disclosure, last week I was blocked by Brian Johnson on Twitter. So take anything that I say with that in mind. I think, unfortunately, the way Brian Johnson is going about doing this isn't something that generalizes to the rest of the population. The reason is, so this guy here, Brian Johnson, he's worth about $400 million after selling a company, and he's spending $2 million a year trying to optimize his health in every possible way. He's got a team of doctors. He's got like all these medical scanners in his house, so he can go and have these various scans every single day or once a week or whatever. He's trying to monitor everything he can monitor, and he's taking, I think, a few dozen, like 10, 20, 30 supplements every single day, multiple supplements with breakfast. He only eats 2,000 calories a day, so he's sort of in this very, very strict diet that he's eating as well. The real challenge, I think the thing, and his health markers have improved since starting this. Like, let's be entirely fair. And to the extent that you can measure biological age, you could argue that his biological age has at least stayed the same, maybe got a little bit younger. There are loads of caveats. Please go and watch the video for some of those. The real problem in terms of generalizing this is that he's exercising a lot, he's sleeping really well, and the diet that he's eating, while the actual specifics of it may or may not be beneficial, he's eating more vegetables, he's eating more nuts. Like, these are things that we should probably all be doing. And so it could be that those diet, exercise, sleep things are what's carrying all of the weight in his blueprint protocol. And then the 30 supplements he's taking, maybe they're making his health worse. Like, we just don't know. And the problem is in science, if you do an experiment where you vary 30 things at the same time and don't control, you don't have a part of your experiment where nothing is being changed, you never know what's actually causing the effect. And there are ways that he could do this. Like, he could try this thing called a crossover trial design, where you try a drug for a period of time, then you stop it for another period of time, then you try it again for a period of time, and try and work out what the change was when you came on and off the drug. There are ways that he could try and turn this experiment just on himself into something a bit more scientific, but the way that he's doing it at the moment isn't particularly productive. And what really frustrates me, and the reason he blocked me on Twitter, is because I suggested that given that he has $400 million, maybe he should be investing in some clinical trials for the drugs that he's using in his blueprint. And a really good example of this, he takes a drug called metformin, which is a diabetes drug that we think might be able to slow down the aging process. There is a trial called TAME, which is targeting aging with metformin. That is a trial that's been in the US struggling to get funding for about the last 5 years. And it would tell us one way or the other whether metformin slows down aging. We'd know the answer rather than just having to guess. And the amount of money, I think the amount of money it needs is $40 million, so a tenth of his net worth. He could just pay for that. But pointing it out, well, he didn't like it.
Hey, Andrew.
Hello.
Thanks so much for the great talk. I really appreciated your perspective on all this. I'm wondering, do you foresee a technology or a biomedical advancement that would drastically improve the conditions around senescence? Something that you might foresee?
Yeah, I think the way that you've got to think about how these treatments are going to develop, when I sometimes talk about a cure for aging, and a lot of biologists hate this because they hate the word cure, but I will rigorously defend it. But one of the problems with the word cure is it sounds like there will be one treatment. But I think there are actually going to be a whole sort of collection of different treatments. I said there are these 10 hallmarks of aging. We might not have to hit every single one, but I think we'll probably need to hit at least 2 or 3 or 4 or 5. And so that means that we might find that you take a senolytic, and then you need to do something to extend your telomeres, and then you need to do something else that's going to help your mitochondria in old age, and so on. And these combination of these therapies is what's going to ultimately make the biggest difference. And I think the way to think about it as someone who's alive today, if you're not on death's door already, these senolytic drugs that I talked about hopefully we'll understand whether they work in disease in the next sort of 5 years. We could imagine in the next 10 to 15 years, perhaps if we're lucky and if we're quick, we can get them working in people who are normal, quote unquote, i.e. Don't have anything in particular wrong with them, just to slow their aging down. There are also things like rapamycin, metformin, these drugs I just mentioned, metformin actually, that we could know literally within a few years whether or not they work if someone would fund the trials. And that would then mean that we could live a little bit longer still. And then, if you look a bit further out into the future, I talk in the book about gene therapies and I talk about stem cell therapies. Those can sound like super futuristic, but actually we already are doing gene therapies in the clinic, like not in the lab. We've got people who are being cured of genetic diseases, things like sickle cell anemia, by giving them gene therapy now. And these are serious diseases. Again, it's a case where you haven't got any other option. It's lifelong pain and suffering or this gene therapy. But they tried it and it seems to work. So as we understand more about how those therapies work, it's not going to be like decades and decades before we're able to do gene therapy. And there are some really easy, low-hanging fruit gene therapies that could extend our lifespans as well. So I feel like it's going to be a whole combination of things. And the real key is that if we could, starting today, if you can, exercise, not smoke, not drink, then live long enough to benefit from the senolytics, live long enough to benefit from metformin or rapamycin if they work, then maybe that means you'll live long enough to benefit from the stem cells and the gene therapy. And then that'll give scientists time to develop the next treatment that I haven't even thought of yet, and so on and so on. Who knows how long we could live? So I don't think it's going to be a magic bullet. Maybe in the year 2400, we'll come up with a pill that does the whole thing in one. But I feel like getting there is going to be a much more piecemeal process. And it's going to be a question of going after all the hallmarks, seeing what works, and sort of gradually working our way towards what I ultimately think should be our goal of curing aging.